Why is China, a country with less than 30% of the GDP of the G7 countries combined, lending as much as the World Bank, the main channel that G7 uses to lend to developing nations? China is a giant in the world of lending. Between 2008 and 2020, China lent nations around the world a total of $462 billion, almost the same amount as the World Bank. And their data shows that China has more loans outstanding to low-income nations than all the member nations of the Paris Club combined. So what are the implications of this, and what is China's goal? Firstly, where China lends is very important. These 10 countries make up 60% of China's global development finance, and the common thread with all of them is that they contain abundant natural resources. There are a few reasons for this, ranging from concrete to highly speculative. The first is that China partakes in a practice called resource-backed lending, which is lending to nations who have high natural resources and using the future revenues from the natural resources as collateral to secure the loan. This is part of a larger theme with Chinese loaning, which is loan security and risk mitigation. But we'll get back to that later. Many believe that China is loaning money to nations that have large amounts of natural resources in order to control those resources either in case of a default or more likely by building relationships with these countries and becoming their ally so that they're able to gain an influence and start operating mines and other resource excursion operations. China is in need of a steady supply of resources as they are the last key element to production and manufacturing. China has vast amount of labor as well as factories with the only possible missing element being resources. The issue with studying China and trying to find its loan terms and agreements is that it is almost impossible in many cases. Since 2015, all of China's loans have had confidentiality clauses, making it impossible for outside observers to analyze the lending between China and other nations. This brings up a plethora of problems, especially since China is competing with large multilateral lenders. This is one of the largest red flags of Chinese lending, so let's delve deeper into this. A multilateral lending organization is an organization that gets its money from a conglomerate of nations and uses that mainly for financial aid, usually for underdeveloped and developing nations. Some of the largest of these are the IMF, the World Bank, and the IDB. These agencies all have their own set of values and purpose that they promote through their lending. Basically, the World Bank and IDB lend to reduce poverty and foster better economic and social situations, while the IMF is more like an ambulance that helps nations in dire financial situations. Fundamentally, when nobody else is willing to take a risk by lending to a nation, most likely because they keep defaulting on the loans, IMF is the organization most go to in order to get a bailout or financial aid packages. They have been criticized for promoting austerity measures, but when a nation is in such bad economic state that it needs an IMF loan, they probably would be best with austerity measures. Recently, Sri Lanka has gone to the IMF for help, but it seems that debt negotiations will be delayed, but that's a different story. The most important thing about multilateral lenders is their value, processes, and transparency. Staffed by technocrats from all around the world. By the very nature of being a multilateral agency, many countries are represented in their boards, which write the rules and monitor the operations. Each agency has its values, but most have terms to promote positive environmental and social change in the nations that they work with. These multilaterals also have a large amount of transparency. If you search IMF in whatever country, you're able to see a large number of documents surrounding IMF lending with the nation, briefings, reports, and more. Chinese loans are missing these two things. They have no transparency and they have no constraints for social and environmental change, which can actually be appealing to some countries. The finance minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Colt Imbert, justified his decision to take a loan from China instead of the IMF, saying that Beijing was not demanding any stringent conditions for its loans, saying, quote, "The Chinese loan have a very attractive interest rate of 2%. The IMF is 1.05%, so there isn't much to choose between them. If you're making a judgment call, one loan, no structural adjustment, you don't have to retrench your people, you don't have to devalue your currency, etc., etc. And then another, you have to do all kinds of terrible things. That's a no-brainer. You'd go with the ones that doesn't have any structural adjustment conditionalities associated with it, especially since the interest rates are very close, just 1% apart. Apart from economic clauses like devaluing the currency, which is misleading, as it's really freeing the currency from artificial prices, the IMF forces environmental and social justice clauses into its contract, not only because the agency believes that both are vital for sustainable economic growth over the long term, but because the nations that finance the IMF, including the G7, share a commitment to those values. Multilateral agencies such as the World Bank and IDB, as well as the IMF, are partly driven by the values of the many nations that fund them, meaning that the values that the organizations promote are not centralized to the whims of one country, but are usually the values that are held by the vast majority of people across the nations part of the organization. China, on the other hand, does not impose any conditions surrounding social and environmental justice, which is very appealing to some nations, and that's where the issue lies. Chinese loans are beating out the World Bank and other developmental agencies all around the world. Off the record, World Bank employees often talk about how they go to nations, especially in Africa, in order to design and negotiate a loan for a particular development project, and the nation's leadership tell them that they already took a loan from the Chinese government, as it had fewer strings attached and conditions to be met. This means that these agencies, which are not just providing loans, but trying to make reforms in nations that need reform, are being beaten out by Chinese loan agencies, who are loaning for both business interests and for China to gain influence over those nations, not for reform. Furthermore, underneath this, there are heavy accusations about how malicious Chinese loans may be. Debt trap diplomacy is a term that describes a creditor country or institution making loans in order to increase the lender's political leverage and even in extreme cases to seize assets from the loan recipient if they're unable to pay back their loans. China has been accused by some, including the Trump Agency, of partaking in debt trap diplomacy, with the most famous case being the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. Those who believe that China is engaging in debt trap diplomacy claim that China influenced Sri Lanka into building a port that it could not afford, taking hundreds of millions of dollars of Chinese debt in order to later seize the port when they could not pay back the debt. But according to Deborah Brautigam, a vocal opponent of the China debt trap diplomacy narrative, explains otherwise in her article, "The Chinese Debt Trap is a Myth." She explains that in 2003, the Sri Lankan government had the idea of making a port in Hambantota, so they went to the Canadian International Development Agency in order to carry out a feasibility study. The Canadians determined that it was feasible and tried to move forward with the project, but were unable to due to the constantly changing landscape of Sri Lankan politics. Later, in 2006, Danish engineering firm Ramboll made similar recommendations as the Canadians, arguing that it was key that an initial phase of the project not include containerized cargo, meaning that the port would start with items like oil, grain, cars, and more to bring in revenue before expanding the port to a second stage, which would be able to handle containerized cargo. Sri Lanka decided to go ahead with the project and approached the US and India, who both said no. But then China Harbor Group learned about the project, and with funding from China Exim Bank, they got the contract. China Exim Bank's loan was $307 million, a 15-year commercial loan with a 4-year grace period and a 6.3% fixed interest rate, as it was 2007 and Sri Lanka was in the midst of a civil war. This $307 million was enough for stage 1 of the project, which was completed on schedule 3 years later. In 2009, Sri Lankan civil war ended and the government embarked on a debt-fueled journey to improve the country's infrastructure, with Hambantota being a large part of the plan, as it was the president's hometown. But he rushed the process of rebuilding. In Hambantota, instead of waiting for phase 1 of the project, non-containerized content, to create revenue, as the Ramboll team had recommended, Sri Lanka's president, Mahinda Rajapaksa, decided to take another loan from China Exim Bank for $757 million at 2% interest rate in order to quickly move ahead to phase 2 of the project. The expert advice previously had been to use cash flow from the success in phase 1 to fund phase 2, a more sustainable strategy with fewer loan amounts, but this wasn't followed. By 2014, Hambantota was losing money. Hence, Sri Lanka's Port Authority signed an agreement with China Harbor and China Merchants Group to have them develop and operate the port together for 35 years, as Sri Lanka already had a relationship with both. The next year, Rajapaksa lost a surprise election that he called to his finance minister. Sri Lanka merits its own video, but Sri Lanka had steep payments on its loans upcoming, putting the government in a terrible situation. When the new president, Sirisena, took office, the country owed $4.5 billion in debt service in 2017, of which 5% was the Hambantota port. The country didn't default on its debt, getting a bailout from the IMF and leasing the port out for 99 years to China merchants for $1.12 billion. The Sri Lankan government made the mistake skipping ahead to phase 2 too quickly. but they seem to have done their due diligence with the port and don't seem to have been pressured by the Chinese government to take their loan. Because if they were able to capture just a small amount of the traffic that goes through Singapore, then the port would have been a success. But Deborah Brautigmann's argument about Hambantota neglects another part of the story, the fact that in total Sri Lanka owes China at least $5 billion, with some saying that it's closer to $10 billion, which if true, makes China Sri Lanka's largest single lender. And for a country whose GDP is $80 billion, this means that Sri Lanka owes about 12.5% of its GDP to China, which is quite a lot and brings up many questions, which can't really be answered due to a lack of transparency. Although Hambantota doesn't seem like an example of debt trap diplomacy, the lack of transparency with Chinese lending is questionable. The fact that Sri Lanka government announced that it would relocate its naval base from Galle to Hambantota, a port controlled by China, is also a bit suspicious, as well as the billions of dollars of separate loans that the country owes China. There are other cases that are similar to Hambantota in the sense that the country takes too much money from China. In many cases, China restructures its loans, but further investigations into each loan are difficult because of confidentiality clauses. China is known, however, to take a pretty hard-line stance in getting its payments. In financial crises where the borrowing country is at risk of default, lenders usually accept that they will have to take a haircut on their initial loan and restructure to get back a portion of their principal. China, on the other hand, decides to take a different approach. Quote, Beijing often fights to get every dollar promised by borrowers, extending the length of the loan but leaving the principal intact, said the Wall Street Journal. Beijing sometimes also gets more than its principal back. In Argentina, there's a Chinese space station in Patagonia that's closed off to the Argentine government and was given to China in secret negotiations. Beijing says that the base is only used for space missions and not for surveillance, but there's no proof since Argentina doesn't have any enforcement mechanisms to make sure that China isn't using the base for other purposes. Even if China is not guilty of debt trap diplomacy to this extent, the influence that it gets over other nations can be used for purposes that go against a basic Western value, freedom, as it is the case with censoring political opposition. China gaining influence worldwide allows the Chinese government to persecute those who speak out against them. This was seen by Chinese artist Badiou Chao, sometimes referred to as the Chinese Banksy. Badiou Chao is an activist who makes much of his art as a criticism of the CCP, and due to this has faced retaliation. When he was slated to have an exhibition in Italy, the CCP complained to and threatened the Italian federal government and the local government of the town where the exhibition was slated to be held. Badiou Chao himself says that he has been threatened and harassed repeatedly by the Chinese government, saying, China is very good at using its capital and money to control, manipulate, and silence people's criticism. And this is how it's reflected in our world, the art market. Chinese influence over countries can manifest into problematic situations where the CCP abuses its influence. Chinese loans have the potential to be problematic, but China's influence spreads further than bilateral loans and becomes quite concerning in the sphere of tech. Chinese investments in tech companies are far-reaching through Tencent and other Chinese companies that in their essence are controlled by the Chinese government. But that's out of the scope of this video. To summarize, there are good arguments on both sides of the debate, but it is interesting that the difficulty in drawing a cut and dry conclusion lies in the fact that Chinese loans are bilateral and mostly secret, lacking transparency. The alternative is multilateral lending, like that provided by the World Bank, designed to and negotiated by technocrats, following a set of rules that many countries have agreed upon. It isn't perfect. It does have some political influence from its board, made of the countries that fund it, and obviously, those who put in more money have more influence. But we can read the loans, we can judge the process, we can evaluate the merits and even the technocrats when they participate in sectoral conferences. And when the countries can't pay, the reprofiling or restructuring also follows a process to access sustainability. If there is a transitory crisis, the IMF comes in. Also, a more transparent institution run by technocrats. So with that contrast, you can draw your own conclusions, or not.